time to review the first book I ever read on Taekwondo. Hi guys, my name is Joe, and welcome to Fighting Words, the martial arts library. Here I do martial arts book reviews and I cover other martial arts related subjects. This week I'm going to be reviewing the book Korean Karate by Keith D. Yates and H. Brian Robbins. This was originally published in 1987. Now, one thing to note about this book is that it was originally designed for basically for children to read. I think that's the thing about stuff in juvenile literature. It's not bad for adults. It's probably less detailed and, has maybe a lower reading level than what you'd find in some books directed toward adult audiences, but the information inside is still pretty useful. In this particular book, it starts off with an intro which goes over the summarized history of Korea and Taekwondo. This is followed by, the stuff you would expect from a book of this sort, like how to tie your belt, as well as how a Taekwondo class might go. I do wonder if this might be a little bit outdated, this particular section. I don't know how Taekwondo classes have changed since 1987, but maybe they have. Now, the first real chapter is on stance, and this goes over things, among other things, the very obvious, like, the fundamental stances used in Taekwondo. But they also go over things like, bowing and how to move in the stance, like, how to advance and how to turn. This is one of two sections where they actually use the Korean terminology. I'll get to the other one in a little bit, but that bit, it's interesting to include in this section, and interesting that it shows up in a different section. We'll get to that. The next chapter is on exercises. Most of this chapter is on stretches. Those include static stretches, dynamic stretches, and stretches with a partner. There are some other exercises shown, like push-ups and sit-ups, but again, it's very heavily focused on stretching. And past that, you get a chapter on punches and kicks. Now, this starts off by showing the basic striking surfaces, the knuckles and the heel of the palm. It'll go over some very basic upper body strikes, like the reverse punch, the ridge hand, and elbow strikes. The kicks get a lot more detail here. And these include the things like the turning back kick and the hook kick, which are sort of advanced. The kicks in particular, you'll see multiple steps to them, whereas the hand techniques, it's like, throw your arm at the guy's head and hit him with the thumb side of your hand. Okay. The next chapter is going to be on blocks, and this is the other chapter that uses Korean terminology. This includes, the basic fundamental blocks, your upward block, downward block, inside block, outside block, and knife hand block. These also include multi-step photos, as well as a how it works section to show you how to apply these blocks in a very classical sense. After that, we get an interesting section where it goes over forms, and it goes over what were at the time the first form each of the International Taekwondo Federation, the World Taekwondo Federation, the American Taekwondo Federation, and the Jun-Ri system. So they're giving kind of a broad overview of the different types of forms here. It's interesting that the first two, the ITF and WTF forms, are given photos, but the ATA and Jun-Ri forms are actually sketched out. It should be noted that since this time, the World Taekwondo Federation forms This is no longer taught as the first form. They've gone on to a different system. I'll list it down here in the bar because I'm not a Taekwondo guy and I don't have this information off the top of my head. The next small chapter you get is on one-steps. One-step sparring is an opponent attacks in a usually pre-specified way, and you perform a defense and a counterattack. The ones here are all defenses versus a lunge punch, so that's something of note. The self-defense section is going to show defenses against different sort of grabs and chokes and locks. So I guess the idea is maybe that the section on one-steps shows you how a Taekwondo practitioner would defend against a striking attack, while the self-defense section is how to defend against a standing grappling attack. The chapter after that one is on sparring, and they introduce the sparring stance here and just give brief examples of, hand combinations and hand-foot combinations. I think there's only one example of each on there. So let's get into the pros and cons. As far as the pros go, I think this is a really good introduction. It touches very concisely on a number of different subjects, everything from history to sparring and one-steps and, self-defense techniques. There's a lot that gets covered there. I like the fact also that it includes the forms from multiple branches of Taekwondo. I think the idea behind that might have been that, you can take this book and it doesn't matter what organization you find yourself in. You can use this as sort of a primer for, your first few months. Again, less so now because the World Taekwondo Federation has changed up the forms that they do, which actually brings me to the cons. So something I found just mildly jarring with this was the inconsistent use of Korean for the different terms. Like I said, you had Korean names for the stances and you had Korean names for the blocks. Why don't you have them for the punches and kicks? I don't know. I don't know if it's bad, but the inconsistency does bother me. It would seem to me that it would flow more smoothly if you either had all the terms in Korean or none of the terms in Korean. Past that, again, this is a bit of a nitpick. There is sort of an unbalanced, the way they address the punches and kicks is a little unbalanced. The kicks get a lot more attention, and I know Taekwondo is known for attention, for its kicks, but at the same time, I do think that they're neglecting the hand techniques, especially since that they will show other hand techniques later, other basic hand techniques, in like the self-defense section, that they didn't cover in the section on strikes. And finally, again, this is sort of a mild nitpick. I've called out how it's certainly outdated when it comes to World Taekwondo Federation forms. It may be outdated in other ways as well. Again, I'm very unfamiliar with Taekwondo past an academic, study of it. I've done drop-in classes once in a while. I've had friends practice it and we cross-train. So because I'm not exposed to it, like on a regular basis, I can't tell you how much is outdated, but I know some of it is. So, who would I recommend this book to? If you can find this book, it's probably going to be pretty cheap. And if you have someone who's curious about Taekwondo, I would say especially, a youngster, someone who this book was directly made to address, the juveniles. I think this would be a really good intro for that. I like keeping it around. I like keeping it around mostly for sentiment. This was in my public library when I was growing up. So again, it's the first book I ever read on Taekwondo. But I also like keeping it around for the sort of the forms from multiple systems shown in it. I think that's just sort of neat. So yeah, it's a good beginner's book if you can find it, and you can probably find it for less than $10. But anyway, that's all I have for this week, and I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you next week.